the cross of audience area, but with here on gender and disability. So working across robotics and HCI in general, and possibly many other spaces. But I leave the stage now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Slide because it somehow stops sharing. Double click this.
Can you see slides again? Okay. Sorry, folks. We've only been doing this for 30 years, so why would it be easy? Can you see the slides now? Okay, let's assume that it's a Zoom issue then. Let's redo the sharing in Zoom. Okay, where's the Zoom?
Here.
Sorry, basically when you're disabled, right, they assume that once you plug into a projector, you no longer have a disability and you can actually see stuff. Is that stop share? Okay. Let's try sharing again. Okay, I chose the right window. Okay. Fantastic. Top one?
Yes.
Okay, and let's move all this garbage out of the way so they can actually see the slides. Sorry, folks, I literally cannot see what I'm clicking on. If you hadn't figured it out, I am in fact low vision amongst other things. And I don't know what this says. Is there an X?
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic. So my name is Jennifer Rode. I'm over in the Institute of Education. I'm an HCI person. I don't actually really work on education that much. I've just done some education in the course of my career because I've studied like programming education, and so I ended up over there. So the goal of this talk is twofold. First, I want to promote broad familiarity with my work as I'm seeking collaborators in computer science. So I'm going to do something a bit weird in parts of this talk, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a whole bunch of stuff with an irritatingly low level of detail. And I'm sorry about that, but I want to give you guys this overview of what I'm doing. But then I'm going to move on to the area of depth, which is about critical computing. So I'm going to talk about theory and how it is actually central to HCI. And I'm going to argue for the increased need of theory as part of user-centered design, especially within critical computing. As I argue, critical theory frames ethnographic encounters, and as grounded theory generated from ethnographic data gives us better guidance on what to build. And this theory is especially vital when we're trying to understand diversity issues around computing. I argue that overwhelmingly the bulk of critical computing in HCI doesn't engage with critical theory. Now, there are certainly examples where they do. Kata Spiel, Rua Williams, a bunch of the great work in the GDI Hub engages with critical theory, but in general, we tend to not engage with critical theory. Okay, so let's go a little bit about background. My first degree is in anthropology out of Carnegie Mellon. I did their HCI program. I did my PhD with Paul Durash and Genevieve Bell. You can definitely see their influences in my work. And I spent a decade in Silicon Valley as a product designer and usability research. Now, I just want to tell you some things that I've built so that the computer scientists in the room think, oh, she can't actually build stuff, before I go on and talk about exclusively ethnography and theory. So here we go. I was the usability lead for the first set-top box that let you pause live TV, that's TiVo. I designed a UbiComp system, the Smart Closet, which was a wardrobe management system that used RFID and social media. That was pulling in my gender theory. I worked on Swirl, a privacy visualization tool that let you set file permissions fluidly. When I was at Cambridge, I worked on WebKit, a tangible user interface for teaching school children how to construct arguments. And then last but not least, Rendezvous, which was an IBM conference call system. But the majority of my work engages with value-sensitive design. So this is Friedman and Hendry's work, which looks at technology is designed in light of the values that are embedded into it, because we know that technologies have implicit biases around race, gender, class, disability, and so forth. And if we don't examine those implicit biases, we're going to just design more technology that's biased. So what I do in my work is I critically examine technology using critical theory, things like feminist theory, trans theory. I have a new PhD student using Dalit feminist theory, which is like class-based Indian-specific feminist theory, critical race theory, social model of disability, to explore the nature of bias with the aim to improve technology. So this is my approach to user-centered design. So broadly speaking, I create UbiComp. I use, oh, fantastic. Let's have a pop-up dialogue in the middle of my slides. I predominantly collect ethnographic data, and I do the thing that everybody else does. I do ethnography. Despite my advisor being Paul Durish, I write implications for design and I design stuff. But I also read critical theory and use that as the starting point for my ethnography, which then influences what I build. And sometimes I build things directly in response. The ethnography causes me to create grounded theory, which causes me to build stuff. So I argue that we need to think about theory. So what is critical theory? Critical theory is a multidisciplinary approach to social philosophy that critiques and aims to transform society by examining power structures, ideology, inequities with a goal of human emancipation. So I use that. It influences my ethnography. Out of my ethnography, I create grounded theory. Grounded theory is theory developed bottom up from qualitative data, which explains patterns of behavior. So for instance, I've developed grounded theory around educational challenges while making, or things like how gender and technical identity shape technology use, or disability theory around computer-mediated touch. Now, as promised, I'm going to give you a couple snapshots of specific research projects that I've worked on in HCI. And then after I do this, I'm going to give you two more, much more in-depth examples of where I'm using theory. So these aren't theory papers. These are just papers. So back in 2000, yes, I am that old. I had a Chi paper on using curved displays as an alternative to head-mounted displays. We created the first curved display as part of this research when I was a master's student. And we looked at the differences between curved displays, small monitors, and HMDs. We showed that head-mounted displays had higher simulation sicknesses than curved displays, which was a huge gender equity issue. And we showed that curved displays outperformed the other conditions for spatial navigation. And given that women are suffering from simulation sickness at higher rates, this implied curved displays would be beneficial for gender equity. And this research helped to establish curved displays as a sort of gold standard in the gaming industry. Second specific example, I had a paper called Dispelling Design as the Black Art of Chi. Back in the early 2000s, we really didn't understand design-based research. So this was one of the early papers. We built on Nelson and Stolterman's design way. We talked about that exciting IBM conference system. And we established that design isn't a black box. It doesn't just happen, but we instead engaged in a series of design judgments. And we laid out that Nelson and Stolterman's book, which at the time was not being read by the HCI community, for the HCI community. Now this is a core teaching paper, and we established design as a rigorous contribution to HCI. When I finished my PhD, I discovered that I couldn't publish my PhD in the HCI literature. I had done an ethnographic study of privacy practices in the home by women, and in the context of family work. And at the time, we had ethnomethodologists publishing ethnography, but we didn't have anthropologists publishing ethnography. And the method wasn't a done thing yet. So we in this paper, what I did was I instead of trying to publish my dissertation, I published a paper explaining that my dissertation method was valid. And we started with explaining the difference between the epistemologies of positivism and reflexivity, and then talking about the different styles of ethnography, because while ethnomethodological ethnography is realist, there's a whole spectrum of ethnographic styles. And we established what the key elements of ethnography are: rapport, participant observation, and theory that allow for achieving a confessional or an impressionistic ethnography. Yeah, and this paper was really helpful in establishing, ethnography, not just ethnomethodological ethnography where you ethnography where you have reflexivity as a core method in HCI. And the last background paper that I want to familiarize you with is a paper called Does Technology Have Race? I wrote this with a lot of wonderful graduate students at Drexel. David Hankerson was the first author. And, these kids were in Philly during the height of the Black Lives Movement, and we were reading the winter article, Does Technology Have Politics, from my class. And, David, who was like, an 18-year-old African-American guy from like the same part of Philly that the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was set in, was like, hey, I think this happens with race as well. Now, at the time, we didn't actually have any papers in the HCI literature talking about racism. We had race conditions, but that's a very different thing. We weren't talking about race. So what this paper did was it provide case studies of how technologies were often less usable by people of color, and it introduced the concept of racism as a form of implicit bias in technology and called for increased minority ethnic representation in user studies. Okay, so now we've had a little bit of sort of broad level background of things that I've worked on. And you probably have noticed it's kind of all over the place. But, the core of my research is looking at issues of power and privilege and value-sensitive design. And so even though I work on a lot of different areas of hardware, AI, telepresence, and making, the overarching theme is examining the intersectional values that we embed unconsciously in technology and try to critically embed better values so that we can hopefully end up with a bit of social justice. I'm not going to be talking about my work on AI and intersectionality because this work is really new, but this is an area where I am working, so I want you guys to be aware of that. I'm going to talk about two case studies. I'm going to talk about the So Simple, and I'm going to talk about telepresence. Please give these back to me because we don't have many of them. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have thrown that, sorry. So this is an early prototype. This is a later prototype. And the point is that, yes, I'm an anthropologist, but I do actually make hardware. Okay, so this started off from the feminist theory from my dissertation, where we were looking at a feminist agenda for HCI. When I went to publish this work, I was told there's no place for feminist theory in HCI. And I couldn't get it into Chi, so I sent it to ECSCW. And I was talking through things like the concept of technology as masculine culture, gender positionality, and lived body experience. And I started arguing for gender as a central question for HCI and talking about in a companion paper the need to ensure gender equity in research samples. Moving forward, I arrived at a model of the socio-technical model of gender and technical identity. So in HCI, we still have a tendency to conflate sex and gender, but they're not the same thing. They're different degrees of social construction. And we know that things like gender inauthenticity are issues. There is a perception in the STS literature that it is hard to present yourself as authentically feminine and technical at the same time. And there are lots of examples of ethnography where women can either present themselves as feminine or technical, but not both. And in this research, I talk about the difference between, your individual gender identity versus societal gender, structural gender. You know, in the United States, Trump just decided we only get to have 2 genders now. You know, progressive countries like Germany have 3, the bourgeois have 5, right? Gender is not static. It's culturally constructed differently in different societies. And then we have the symbolic gender, which is the gender that we ascribe into the technology. So when we talk about gender at HCI, we need to stop just saying gender. Which of these 3 kinds of gender are we talking about? And all of these relate to how you identify as a technical individual, right? It's not just your ability and it's not just your self-efficacy, which is your confidence level. It's whether you project that confidence. I encountered women in my dissertation work and in my time at TIFO that had software engineering degrees, but in the context of the social dynamic of their household, would pretend they knew nothing because they just wanted their husbands to set up the equipment, set up the network so that that's one less thing to worry about. So they presented their agency as if they were atechnical. And this is one thing that became really clear to me, that we can't just study gender in the laboratory because gender is constructed very differently in a social context. So this theory is something I used when I got to Siegen with Volker Wolf's team, and we started testing the LilyPad Arduino. So the LilyPad Arduino is a little microprocessor that's supposed to teach programming, and we know that Leah Buckley argues that e-textiles are a great way to get girls into computing and encourage gender equity. And out of this research, we looked at where people were having problems with programming, and we started coding based on all of Wing's computational thinking issues. And what we realized is this wasn't where people were actually struggling. The kids in our sample were struggling around things like aesthetics, creativity, construction, visualizing multiple representations, and understanding materials. So we created out of this ethnographic theory, out of this ethnographic data, this grounded theory of computational making. And we argued if we want to achieve gender equity in computer science, we can't just teach about computational thinking, we need to be teaching about computational making. And this has actually been picked up by the CS Ed literature, and I don't know why there's cites. Oh, I had a job talk, that's why the citations are on here, ignore that part. So when I got to Britain as faculty at UCL, I realized that the BBC had just spent millions and millions of pounds on the microbit. And, you know, I shouldn't be doing LilyPad Arduino research, I should be doing microbit research. So I was like, okay, great, I'm gonna just take this thing into the field and do user studies. And here's what we saw. This is a really cute cat. And I don't know if you can see up there, but there are little alligator clips that are being used along the top that they have to sort of sew in, and the whole thing shakes around. And what was happening was we were having a huge self-efficacy issue. People weren't able to create connections that were mechanical and electrically secure at the same time. What happens when you have low self-efficacy and your circuit doesn't work? You get the impression, oh, I'm dumb, I can't do computer science. So we went off and we designed the So Simple, which hopefully is circulating around. And the key thing about the So Simple is that it has 3 ports that are just for mechanically securing the hardware to your garment, so that when you're actually trying to create electrical connections, the 1, the 2, the ground, the 3 volts, you already have a secure garment. And the microbit slips inside. So we've been doing a lot of user testing work, and we have a design patent, we have a little bit of funding even, and we've been developing like pedagogical materials to support it. But don't worry, there's still more theory. We also realized that this dichotomy of talking about gender diversity in computer science, which is very much often framed in this gender binary of girls versus boys, is really artificial. And so working with Phoebe Toops-Dugas and Andrew Kern, we talked about how we need to reframe the characterization of diversity in computing to include trans and non-binary perspectives, and we argue for an integrated trans feminist theory for computing. So just because I am looking for collaborators, this is what we're doing now. So we are in the process of trying to create educational tools around the Create AI so we can use the microbit to take advantage of all of the cool new, the microbit and the So Simple to take advantage of all of the new cool AI features. We, in response to the last round of user testing, are designing an advanced and a basic version because the version of a So Simple that you want for those 8-year-old kids is very different for a university student that's going to want something more complicated. I am in the Institute of Education, so my darling pedagogy colleagues are writing me beautiful teaching materials. And we are hopefully going to be working with somebody from software engineering to work on extensions for Make Code and Create AI. And I really would like to productize this because I believe that So Simple pushes back against this masculization of technology and allows for a range of a multidimensional range of gender identities engaging in programming and making. Okay, so we're back to this slide again, but now it has data on it. So yeah, I created my widget, the So Simple. I created it in response to ethnography. I did the usual thing where I had implications for design and it went straight here. But what we also had was my computational making theory and the socio-technical model of gender and technical identity. Were influenced by the ethnography and influenced the So Simple. And the integrated transfeminist theory was responsive too. So hopefully you're starting to see my argument now. And I think I'm talking too quickly because I got all of that in 20 minutes. I'll try to slow down a bit. Hopefully you're starting to see my argument as to why theory, both critical theory and grounded theory, can actually help us create better hardware that's more equitable. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk about telepresence. So by telepresence, I mean like the things on the stick that are about, 5-6 feet tall. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, it's the one that Sheldon used when he decided his body was too precious. So we started off with an autoethnography. That's me and my cat driving a telepresence robot at Kai. And yes, my cat did drive the robot. And one of the best points of my career was accidentally scaring somebody. And they screamed, "There's a cat driving a telepresence robot." It was quite fun. So all of those early telepresence studies, I was a user. Now I have lupus, which means I have really bad arthritis. And, at this phase in my career, I was intermittently using a wheelchair. Thank God I was using a wheelchair at conferences. I was using a cane. Lupus comes and goes. You have like different body parts that work different days. But today's a good day. I have lots of body parts that work. So, this was based on my lived experience as a disabled person, not studying disabled people like ants, but me as a disabled person talking about my own experience. There was a theory here. So, there was top-down theory. The social model of disability was in here, this notion that society is what's disabling. Haraway's notion of the cyborg, that there's not a clean binary between the human and the technology. It became very unclear where I stopped and where the robot started because the robot became part of me. So it's important to understand that the robot didn't fix me, as is often implicated by the medical model of disability. And it didn't even augment my experience to make it more palatable to the able-bodied majority. Instead, it gave me agency as a disabled person to make conscious trade-offs between the affordances of my corporeal body and an emergent cyborg self in the context of a degenerative autoimmune disease. So in this article, basically, I try to improve the social acceptance of like the disabled cyborg person. And moving forward with this work, that's what I've been doing, is trying to understand how can we create a place in society for disabled people who can't physically be present, who can actually participate perhaps via robot. Now, one of the bottom-up theories, so we have inductive things which come from critical theory. We have deductive, inductive. So the point is that we get to the point where it's abductive because they're coming from both directions. But the data that came out of my robot use was this notion of handless feeling. So I argue in my work, I've lost my mouse. Where's my mouse? That the robot also had implications for a new form of embodiment. I noticed that when I was driving a robot, if I hit a wall, I didn't physically hit a wall, but I still flinched. When a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years casually put their hand on my robot, I felt a sense of connection. And I started theorizing that as handless feeling. And it builds on Durish's theory of embodiment, which Janet Vertese applied to her work on the Mars rover. So Janet Vertese in her work on the Mars rover talked about how the folks at NASA driving the robot started to see the robots as an extension of themselves, and they started, quote, seeing like a rover. And this notion of handless feeling and this deep embodiment led to a sense of embodied freedom. And it's been a while, so you need an ethnographic vignette. So for 3 beautiful days, 1 UbiComp, 1 fall, I could walk at a brisk pace for 6 hours at a time. I could nimbly weave through crowds. I could look people in the eye. I became a cyborg. My flesh body was in Philadelphia, whereas my other body was in Seattle, and my mind was somewhere in between or neither. Scooters, wheelchairs, and canes were replaced by this other embodiment, and I felt free. And it's this motivation as a disabled person with the lived experience of using a telepresence robot that became the starting point for the next 10 years of my research using telepresence. So when I got to the UK, I started doing really basic stuff. I just wanted to see, people kept saying you can't use telepresence in schools, children can't drive it safely. So I did a very boring lab study where we had people drive telepresence robots through obstacle courses and find objects. And we concluded while the technology was unstable for schools, children were very excited about telepresence. They liked it as a possibility to play. One of the things that I got really excited about was letting disabled kids who are often left out of social environments, give them the chance to do recess with everybody else. And we've played a lot of football with telepresence robots. And we concluded that children weren't dangerous while driving, although we did think that shared control AI systems would be beneficial. So at that point, having established, mostly to my colleagues in the IOE, that we were unlikely to kill anyone with my telepresence robots, because this was a big source of concern, I obtained permission to start using telepresence robots in my own classroom. So I teach this class, or I taught this class called Digital Anthropology. And it's a hybrid class with half of my students physically coming on campus, and the other half of my students are joining from around the world. And my students had the choice between, well, the online students couldn't come in person, but they could be the face-to-face students, you could choose, do you want to come in person? Do you want to be via Zoom? Or do you want a robot-mediated experience? And in the spirit of creating an ethical study, you could use my robots and opt out of the study, although very few people did that. And so this study, was built on that earlier theory of computer-mediated telepresence. Sorry. Okay, I see what I'm doing now. So we've done this for 2 years now. And, in the first year, we were able to write a really nice assets paper where we looked at what sort of accessibility problems people were having. Now, my classes aren't the most diverse, but we did see that telepresence robots are not designed with disabled students in mind. And we saw that I unfortunately had, thank God I had a good relationship with my students. So they, talked about it. And I don't think I traumatized anybody. But my students who refer to themselves as, as autistic, they never use autism spectrum disorder. They just call themselves autistic. Talked about how often they felt overstimulated with the wheels and the moving and all of the window management. I had students in my class with PTSD who expressed concern that they felt like the robots were sneaking up on them. And we tried to work through these things. So there are a lot of issues where the robots as they stand are not really well thought through to be used in a context with a lot of disability. But what we did see was that even for the students who had accessibility challenges with the robots, that, Janet Murray's theory. So Janet Murray is an older scholar from like the late 90s who wrote a really early VR piece called Hamlet on the Holodeck. And she talked about to feel truly participatory in a virtual world, think like a holodeck on Star Trek, you had to go through 3 phases. You had to go through having immersion, agency, and transformation. So immersion is you needed to feel like you were really there. I think I'm in the room with my students, even though I'm in Abu Dhabi on the robot. And then agency is I feel like I have power in the room. So, I had one student who, God bless her, one day she was like, can I actually touch stuff with the robot? You said I could touch stuff with the robot. I'm like, yeah, you can touch stuff with the robot. She said, what can I touch? And then she accidentally hit the window because she wanted to look out the window. And she's like, but I can move things? And I'm like, yeah, push the chair in. So she slams the chair in and she's like, wow, that worked. And I just pulled the chair back out and I didn't say anything. And I watched her slam the chair back in. And then I'm like, I'm going to go to the ladies' room because it was a break in class. And I pulled the chair out a 3rd time. And as I walked out of the room, I heard the thud of her enjoying the agency of, for the 3rd time, shoving the chair into the table. I had a Kai once where I went to a workshop via telepresence robot, and there was no room for me as a disabled person at the table. And I'm like, oh, that's right. I'm a good robot driver. And I hit the chair on my robot, pulled it out of the way, and pulled my robot up to the table. And there was a place for me. And I had agency. So this study showed that you can have immersion, you can have agency. And then the question is transformation. So transformation, is, you can look at it using Durish's theory or Vertese's or Murray's, but this notion that you have a fully embodied experience where the robot feels like it's an extension of you and you no longer have a separate identity. It's not, if you want to get into Heidegger, it's a tool that's an extension of you and not a tool that you're consciously manipulating. So we did see this in my study. And this is one of my favorite pieces of field work in my entire career. And so this is a little bit of reflexive field notes for the grad students I was talking to earlier. Very confessional. It never occurred to me that you could play keep away with a telepresence robot. Thus, it was to my exceptional surprise after class one day when I looked up and I saw Nando and RA1 playing and laughing in a good-spirited fashion while chasing each other around my classroom. Nandu had been attending via a Beam Plus robot calling in from India, and RA1 had been providing him classroom-based technical support. Every time one of them approached the other, they would dart off in a different direction, laughing happily. Even as an anthropologist, this sort of technologically mediated interaction was never something I'd considered. Both of these young men were graduate students. Yet there was something magical about this technology that afforded grown men this childlike joy. In this moment, Nandu had achieved a fully embodied experience, having both immersion and agency, and achieved what Murray calls transformation. Being half a world away, yet he was also in my classroom playing with his dear friend. And so I argue for people with disability that this moment of transformation where the robot feels like an extension of you is really a desirable thing. Now, I want to do these slides in a different order. I'm going to tell you what I'm doing now with my robots, and then we'll go back to my beautiful theory map. So I am in the process of trying to write research grants to design better robots with shared control systems. And I'm looking for computer science partners, people that know robotics, people that know AI, to work with me. I'm working with my education colleagues in the IOE to develop pedagogical support for teaching best practices with robots. It's not straightforward. Just as many of you, when you switched online to Zoom during COVID, teaching with a robot in your classroom is also a very different teaching experience. But it was really important to my students with disabilities to have this choice. One of the things that we saw using the robots in a classroom context is that window management was a nightmare, right? You had the app for driving the robot, which had its own speaker and camera and microphone. You then had the learning management system, so Moodle. And then you had Zoom or Teams, which had its own microphone and camera and speaker. You had your note-taking software. You had some papers that were in PDF and some papers that were in Cortex. It's not surprising that my neurodivergent people were like, oh my God, there are too many windows. We know that Gregory Abowd in the late 90s designed Classroom 2000, where they put all of this stuff minus the robots into an integrated learning management system. And I would like to see an integrated learning management system that includes telepresence. And beyond that, I'm also interested in looking at telepresence robots in religious contexts. So I'm also doing a study where I'm looking at rabbis' attitudes towards telepresence robots. Because, leaning into my positionality as a Jewish person, I have access to synagogues. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to go to a mosque or a church. I wouldn't have that, insider perspective. So I, as a starting point, want to understand, is it possible so that elderly, disabled, and the dying who can't go to synagogue, who lose the ability to pray for peace and safety in the world, who feel cut off from their community, if we could give them a telepresence mediated communication? And this is important to me because what I discovered is that I go to synagogue via Zoom all the time. And when I do show up synagogue, they were like, who are you? And I'm like, are you a new member? I'm like, no, I've been a member for 2 years, but I do go to Zoom shul and y'all have no idea who I am because the technology makes me invisible to the point that even though I, go and pray for peace, I don't actually get any contact. And so, I want to look at telepresence as a tool for disabled people, not just in an educational context, but in broader social contexts. And I've also done some work in museums, although I am finding in the UK that the museums won't let telepresence robots into them because they do not like their lithium-ion batteries, and no amount of explaining that thermal runaway is not an issue for a computer-controlled battery seems to be getting me anywhere. Okay, so again, what I want to point out is that the work that we're doing with developing these classroom telepresence robots is influenced by ethnography, but at the same time, understanding, there's this back and forth here where the Haraway and the Siebers is the particular disability studies guy that I use. Vertisi, the Durash, the handless feeling, and the transformation, all of these theoretical aspects were critical to telling me what to build. So what I want you to take away from my talk today is that while critical computing is often a theoretical in the HCI literature, I am arguing that theory is vital to understanding data and vital to telling us what to build. And in order to really engage in value-sensitive design, we need to really richly understand the intersectionality of gender, race, class, and disability theory. And only by abductively engaging with theory can we make the most of user-centered design in order to design equitable technologies that support the social good. Okay. Questions? I have extra slides.
Is there any question? Oh, hi, Ben.
Hi, good to see you again.
Question about the telepresence robots.
Sure.
You talked about the museum's aspect.
Yeah.
It made me think about all the accessibility problems in one of the museums, like the building.
Totally.
Having a telepresence robot rolling around in the building that's full of stairs, like the Natural History Museum, which is beautiful, but absolutely not. Absolutely not accessible to anything that functions on wheels.
Yeah.
It also made me think about outdoor spaces like ZSL, that sort of thing. Yeah, what sort of mediations are you able to make when designing these studies and those spaces?
So,
May I ask if you could repeat the question because it was not, and then answer.
okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Sorry for that.
And what was your name?
I'm Alex.
Alex. Okay, so Alex asked, sorry, Alex, I should know you by now, but so Alex asked, what about like all the inaccessible museums? And so many of the inaccessible museums do have elevators. And while, you know, the Faraday cage effect, killing your telepresence robot, is definitely a known thing, somehow I managed to get UCL ISD to install wireless in IOE's elevators so that my telepresence students could have the agency to run between the floors. And that certainly seems to help. The work that I've done in museums so far has been in like zoology, and I also had a telepresence robot that went to that digital art exhibit that was at the Tate a couple months ago. And so, you know, we stayed in one exhibit, and I was able to bring in an old robot that didn't have a lithium ion battery, one of the old beams. So, I mean, you know, at some point there are robots that run up and down stairs, they're drones. I think that we can, you know, deal with that. The same issue that you raised regarding old museums is the same deal for old British schools that, you know, are like Victorian, and they often don't have elevators. Some of the smaller robots, though, like if you look at Judy Olson's, I don't remember the name of her PhD student, but the PhD student that did all the actual work on telepresence did ethnographic studies in like, I think it was middle schools in the US, and they were using the beams. And the nice thing about the Beam Plus, the small one, is those things are light enough that you can carry them up and down a flight of stairs with one hand. And, you know, we did see that really quickly, you know, Rua Williams talks about this, like that all robots are disabled. But, you know, we saw that we saw that the other students like really stepped up and, you know, would move things out of the way. You know, like I had my students wanted to go to the bar after class one week, and so they all they took their colleague with the robot down to the bar, the IOE bar. And, you know, before I knew it, they had helped the student into the elevator and pressed the buttons for them and said, hey, do you want to go to the bar with us? And she's like, yeah, why not? And so, you know, the student got a glass of beer from her house in Spain and had a beer with everybody else. And they didn't, you know, they didn't feel like left out, right? You and you're probably not gonna do that with Zoom. So I think that, it's like a pro and con thing, and I think that the pros probably outweigh the cons, but there are some hairy things with stairs that need to be addressed. But we are having stair walking robots that can happen at some point. Hi.
Hi there, Jennifer. My name's Mariam. Thank you for your talk.
Hi,
It's
Mariam.
really, really interesting. I am also interested in the telepresence robots.
Mhm.
I work in health and social care,
Okay.
specifically creating technologies that are used for residential and home care.
Mhm.
And I was really starting to think about how a technology like this can help elderly people. I know there was mention of that probably in religious settings.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you've had a thought about like just the well-being from a psychological and social standpoint that this could probably aid in.
So I did, when I was at Drexel, a little pilot project where we brought this into a Jewish nursing home, because that's where I have access. And we talked to elders, and they definitely took issue with the fact that the one I had wasn't height adjustable, and they didn't like that it was towering over them. But for people that were ambulatory, they really liked the idea of their daughter-in-law. Like, I live in the US, I live in the UK. My mother lives in the US in Florida. She doesn't like to walk by herself. But I think if I had a telepresence robot and I could like roll alongside her, and the guy that does up in Canada that does all the cool telepresence research has figured out how to make the robots work outside, to answer your other question. I think that like, just that those activities of like taking a walk with your elder, or going down to the dining hall, and she can eat her food in her elder care facility, and I can, maybe it's her dinner and my lunch, but we can have a meal together. I think that there's a lot of power for intimacy and embodied experiences.
This has really brought me back as well. I used to work for Aldi, the supermarket.
Okay.
And a project that I was working on was looking at having a technology like this. I don't think it was called this, but it was more a robot that they trialed in America in a supermarket, where you can say, oh, where are the chips? And the robot would say, oh, it's on the aisle on the left, and possibly walk with you as well. So obviously there's implications of this that are beyond just social impact. So yeah, interesting.
I guess within an elder care context, I would wonder if maybe we should use robots with collision detection, because you have less agency, but you're also less likely to accidentally bump into something. On days that my arthritis is really bad, am I the safest driver? Maybe not.
Yeah. You said something, you mentioned something in your presentation about having co-pilots. So almost, is it like an AI?
Yeah, so I was talking to Tom Carlson, who is a robotics professor. I think some of you guys in the GDI might have worked with him. And he was doing shared control systems for wheelchairs. Like 95% of the time, if I click on that door, I want to go through the door. Now, occasionally I want to bang my head on the door to be dramatic, but, so we wouldn't want to make it impossible to bang your head on the door. But, most of the time, if I click on that brown box, I want to go through it. And, rather than making me plot all the courses to get there, if the AI could get involved and, statistically model it so I was more likely to go to the places that I'm probably more likely to want to go to the front of the classroom or the door than I am the corner over by Martin. Now, I might still want to go gossip with Martin and after class and go over and hang out with him. Yeah, I love gossiping with you. But we can weight the probability but try to let people continue to have the agency. And so I think that shared control systems with the disabled and the elderly and the dying, the rabbis were really, really interested in telepresence robots for like end of life care, because people just end up so isolated, for the last 6 months of their life when they're dying in a hospital bed. So which is why I sort of bracket them out from the elderly, because I think that's a really compelling use case within the elder care space.
And the final, sorry, just the use case about the cat. How are you teaching your cat to navigate technology?
Okay, so my cat, is my service cat. So like in a very like Haraway kind of way, the division between me and my cat was very low. And my cat had been just sitting on my lap watching me drive telepresence robots for like hours and hours. And literally, I don't think this was especially intentional, but she did put her paw down. And when you put your paw down, you can actually drive the robot. So one of the things that I now have to do in health and safety is to tell everybody to please log out if you have animals at home when you're not in front of your computer, lest your cat, dog, or goldfish try to drive them.
Yes, so there's an online question from Diana Kang, also from Imperial. Could you recommend more feminist theories or more feminist HCI theories for early researchers to read?
Diana, thank you so much. So I would definitely go back and read Haraway because she really goes back and pushes against the gender binary. And I'm not telling you to read me because that would be tacky, but if you go back to this paper, the Reframing Diversity and the Basis of Computing, there's a section in that paper where I go through like every major feminist STS scholar. And I also go through basically like all the theories that get us to this model. So I would read Cavande, I would read Walkman, I would read Sherry Turkle, I would read Harding, and Haraway. Other questions?
There is one more online by Huda El Mimouni.
Oh, why are my old grad students hassling me? Okay, Huda, what do you have to say?
You argue for an abductive interplay between critical theory and design, where theory actively shapes what we build. In practice, how do you decide which theoretical constructs are actionable enough to translate into concrete design decisions, especially when working with engineers or collaborators who may not share that theoretical background?
So that was a great question, Huda. Huda is a new lecturer up in Waterloo, an assistant professor in American and Canadian terms, and is brilliant. You really need to, I read broadly, and I write memos, right? I'm an ethnographer. So as I'm coding, I code around the various theories that I've read. And if I see, that I'm commonly using a particular bit of theory, then I will memo to see whether I can actually credibly support the use of that theory. And, I move from the open coding to the axial and the selective coding. And, at the selective stage, things become, a theory becomes more central. And, there are lots of theories that, aren't supported and get thrown along on the wayside. But I think memoing and really looking at your data and see if you have good examples that support it, but also good counterexamples that lay out where the boundaries are and where the breakdowns are.
Cool. Any last question?
Hi.
Hi, my name is Tweet, and great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in the area of like you bringing on the theories and the ethnography insight into the design and practices, because I think it's like just follow up on the question recently about, I wonder, like nowadays there's a lot of like multidisciplinary team working on design of new technology, and as he said, like maybe they don't have the same understanding or the same foundation knowledge of inclusion or how technology excludes someone. So like in your experience working in multiple spaces, what would be a good solution to that? Like should a computer science student come out university aware of all of those inclusion aspects? Or like there should be a foundational training in the company for that multidisciplinary team to aware of that before working on design?
Yeah, so when I was at Drexel, one of the required classes to get a degree in computer science was a class called Gender and Technology. And we made everybody learn the basics of this stuff. And I think it resulted in a lot of, predominantly young men graduating out of that program that had a really good foundation in feminist computing. And it resulted in um, a sensitivity that I haven't seen in, computer scientists that haven't had that background. So I am wholly supportive of every HCI degree, of every computer science degree. If you don't have a whole class, at least, having a significant portion of a module on that. But, the overwhelming majority of computer scientists haven't had that. And I have been pilloried by reviewers and colleagues over some of this stuff. And what I do is I lean into my tendency as an anthropologist to tell stories. So I find evocative, powerful stories from my fieldwork that show why the theory matters. And rather than trying to teach a particular theorist, which is a bit Byzantine and a bit abstract, I, try to tell a story with a moral. And it's like Jen's Aesop fables of feminist engineering, right? And so I would encourage, don't talk about the theory, talk about the examples from your data that illustrate the theory that's important. You have to engage in selective disclosure. In my career, I was talking to some grad students earlier. I can't think of a single time I managed to get any grounded theory or critical theory that I've created published in the Chi conference. I've been going since 1999, right? I've made a career. The focus of my career is creating grounded theory and using critical theory. And there are places where, they're really receptive to it in the HCI community. The old Chi track was really receptive, the European CSCW community. But, the rest of the time I publish stuff at Chi and the theory's there. I just don't talk about it. Once the Smart Closet paper was all about feminist theory. And I cut out every single piece of feminist theory to get that paper published. And I simply described the system architecture, the design process, and the user study. And then I showed up at UBComp, and because I'm extremely difficult, I said, hey, if you want to hear about my system, read the paper. But, since we're all here, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that for the next 20 minutes, I can tell you all the feminist theory that allowed me to arrive at this design. And, did it make it in the proceedings? No, but I still got it into the room and, had the ability to tell a lot of young people at UBComp what feminist theory was and why it would, help them with their design. And some of my colleagues were really mean, and they walked up to my master students and my PhD students, like these, young guys that had just been doing the hardware stuff for the Smart Closet, and they would be like, are you a feminist? But it resulted apparently in a whole lot of conversation between my graduate students and young men trying to have a conversation as to why feminism is a good starting place for design. And it's all intersectional, so it's really hard to think about gender, and it's hard to think about race and class and disability unless we also think about feminist approaches.
Thank you. I think that is,
I get to stop talking.
yes. And thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for the lovely questions.
Yeah, anybody want to